Welcome to the Fundraising Elevator, where we're all headed up. This podcast is a production of Swaim Strategies, a consulting firm dedicated to nonprofit fundraising events. We're coming to you today from the studios of the AV department. Please welcome our hosts, Kristen Steele and Samantha Swaim.
Hello, and welcome to the Fundraising Elevator, where we're all headed up. We are very excited for today's conversation. This has been the number one requested topic that we have had from folks. So in our world, when we're talking about events, we're so frequently talking about fundraising events, gathering people, bringing people into our spaces, and yet we're often working with social justice organizations that have inherent concerns about doing so. And we, once upon a time, realized that when you bring money and alcohol into the conversation, you need some policies and protections around that. Then as gun violence increased, we started thinking about how do we create protections around that. Now there's questions about sort of legal ramifications, ICE impacts at events, public safety at events, and the number one conversation request we have is how do we think thoughtfully about our gatherings? So we have a special guest with us today that we are thrilled to talk to. Yep. We are joined by Kim Warnick, who is with Western State Center and is the director of Culture Lab at Western State Center, a pro-democracy nonprofit that has spent the past 40 years supporting communities and leaders in building the inclusive democracy we deserve while pushing back against bigoted and far-right movements. She has a sociology degree from Harvard College and a master's in security and terrorism from the University of Maryland. She is a culture organizer and violence prevention expert who works primarily with music, culture, and community-based organizations. Kim's current focus is supporting cultural workers, venues, and artists in the urgent fight for inclusive democracy. She has spoken at multiple industry conferences. She had her work featured in Teen Vogue and Billboard, and is a She Rocks Award recipient for her sexual violence prevention work in the music industry. Kim, welcome to the Fundraising Elevator podcast. We are so excited to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Basically a badass.
I know, a total badass. I feel like we are in the presence of greatness.
I know. I love that so much.
Well, I'm curious to know first just how one gets into this work. What was your path that inspired you to get involved in this work?
Yeah, it's a weird job I do. I sort of stumbled into it when I was a teenager. So I loved music. I went to shows a lot. I grew up in New Hampshire. So I went to a show once and saw an organization tabling and talking to people. And then I learned that they also had done like a service project earlier in the day with people who were going to be attending the show. And I just thought it was really smart to just meet people where they're at, to connect people into something local that they can stick with in an ongoing way. And then when I went to college, I was going to school in Boston. This organization was based in Boston and I interned with them. So I really learned at the intersection of social justice and music. Awesome. And then I've dabbled a little solely in music and was like, not for me. And then I sometimes do like social justice work and community organizing without that music and cultural component. And I get a little sad. So I like to sit right at that intersection. And then because I was learning there, starting at 18, the issue that drew me in the most was sexual violence in that work. So I started doing like some consent education and bystander education for high school students, and then just kept working with a local rape crisis center, both sort of like on the hotline and on the education side in a volunteer capacity, and really built that up. And that was the issue I knew the deepest. And so that really just brought that into the music industry. I think it will surprise no one that the music industry has a little trouble with sexual violence. And so built out some work around that for about 5 years while I was leading an organization. And then I decided, sexual violence wasn't enough. So I went to grad school to learn about terrorism. And here we are. Yeah.
Sexual violence wasn't enough. So I went to grad school to learn about terrorism.
I hope you have a T-shirt that says that you wander around in. That just sounds fantastic.
I value and appreciate that was your motivation. Mm-hmm. Thank you for doing this work.
Yeah.
Kim, I think level setting is helpful for folks. Everybody is operating in a different microclimate with sort of their own perceived pieces as well as what's real for them. From where you sit, what does safety mean these days? What should we be planning for?
Yeah, it's a great question. So sometimes when we think about safety, these images of like metal detectors or long TSA lines or, bag checks, these different things sometimes come to mind. And those are very like securitized versions of safety. When I think about safety, I think about, is someone greeting people and making sure that they feel welcome? Are we up to code on our fire alarms? I know that's like not the most interesting piece, but thinking about like, have we done the physical safety things, like make sure that we can gather here, whether that's, masking up if there's a lot of health compromised folks, or having good ventilation, making sure that there's EMTs who are trained in CPR, really just thinking about it holistically. And then also thinking about, can people show up here as their full selves? Can someone come here with their full identity and just exist and belong? Or are people feeling like they need to hide parts of themselves in order to enter your space? That's not full safety. And so we're trying to think about what are the ways that we can build safety and then signal that safety to folks so that they know that they can be there, or so that they know that they should, maybe make those precautions for themselves, right? Like we don't want to lie. And so it's thinking about like, do your values, do your precautions, and do your hopes match up with what you can actually deliver for the people you're inviting into your space?
You said something that I want to ask further about. So you tapped into this idea of like whole person.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, you were also talking about like physical logistics. And so I want to break that down just a little bit and ask you sort of a two-part question is, when you're entering into an event space, can you talk to us about what are the things you're looking for from like a physical safety perspective or logistics perspective? And then what are the things that you're thinking about for the human experience?
Yeah. I am not a great party guest. So I walk into a room and I'm like, where are the exits? Are there signs? Can I find things without having to ask someone? So like, is there a bathroom sign? Is there an exit sign? Can I see it even when the lights come down? If there's stuff on the floor, is it taped down? Like, are people going to be tripping over cables or rugs? If it's not a carpeted floor and it's raining, are we thinking about that? So those are some of the physical things. I know that, some of those are the basics, but I think if we can't nail the basics, it's not building a lot of trust for me that the more complicated things around someone's like identity-based safety, if we don't even get those right. So I'm also looking about accessibility. Like, are there ramps? Are there spaces for a wheelchair user to be able to move through? Can they use the bathroom? Are there signs that give you some information about this place's values? So, do they have a Confederate flag on the wall? That's going to give me some information. Do they have a pride flag on the wall? That's going to give me some information. Are there show posters when I'm looking at a venue? Is it all white dudes? That's going to give me some information about who they're used to serving. Or is there a diversity of artists that they're bringing into that space? That's also going to give me information. I also think about like, can I see staff anywhere? Does anyone work here? What if I have a question? Like, is it easy for me to figure out who works there? Or are they like not wearing uniforms or name tags or any way that indicates like who I should go and ask for help? And then I also look at like, is there water anywhere? Do I have to buy water here, or is there like a water station? So there's a bunch of like little pieces like that are helping without ever talking to someone, helping me clock sort of how is this space, thinking of proactively about safety and communicating to me about safely before I, even really entered the space.
It's interesting. I'm often the person at our event site that's doing that walkthrough to make sure that all those things are addressed, including like, is the cable taped down? Are the boxes moved? Are the pathways open? Are the tables 10 feet apart? Do we have space in between for wheelchair users? Are there pinch points we need to clear? And yet I frequently am a guest where I am also the bad guest. I walk into that space and I'm like, oh no, it immediately puts the brain on alert. And there's a lot of neuroscience connected to that. We frequently on this show talk about a neuroscience researcher named Paul Zak, who has done a lot of group dynamics and immersion with experiences and kind of what creates a positive, good lifetime investment experience. Like, I want to keep coming back to this organization or this venue or this performer. And one of those things is staging. And that's what you're talking about right now is, are the key indicators in place to help me navigate the space easily? And if they are, it actually has this impact on the brain that says, okay, you can relax now. You can be a part of it. You can participate because you don't need to be on alert. You don't need to be the one thinking about all these things because they've already been thought about. And they're like subtle. I notice them, you notice them, but probably most guests don't notice them. And yet it still tells their brain that they can relax. And so I think it's a piece of the puzzle that sometimes when we're in the middle of planning our event and we're worried about all the details, we sometimes forget about those simple things like, is the signage clear? Do we have a greeter at the door? Is it easy to navigate? Have we made it like a calm environment based on the fact that all of those parameters are already covered and taken care of?
Well, and Kim, I wonder too, I'm struck by the idea that I think I have spent a lot of time thinking goal was neutrality. Like the goal in our logistics planning and safety planning and all of those things was neutrality, but it's not. Can you talk about that? I think that, to me, I think that's sort of the base entry into the idea of creating belonging spaces around identity, right? That's absolutely not neutrality in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important for, I think a lot of people think that, right?
Yeah.
And so to think about what does neutrality mean? Neutrality often means like the status quo, right? So neutrality isn't really neutral. It's whatever you're experiencing as dominant out in the world.
Right.
That's what, if you're not countering what's dominant, you're not actually neutral. You're replicating what society's dominant forces are doing. And like, look around. I don't think we want to do that at our events. And so you have to be thoughtful about sort of like, what are the adjustments you're making to the space that you have ownership over so that it doesn't replicate. And even as you were talking before and thinking about like, okay, a lot of guests don't clock those things. And I think that's true. And the other piece is that folks who've been marginalized by mainstream society do notice those things, right? The more like the different ways that society tells us we're not safe or we don't belong makes our brains be searching for those cues. So yes, some of that I do because of my training, but some of it I do because of my lived experience of being in spaces and going, ooh, that wasn't safe. That was something that made it unsafe. And so in order to do that, we have to do way more than neutral, right? And so part of that is thinking about your event team and saying, what are our values and how do we want people to feel when they walk into a room? I think is a really nice question to ask, right? Like, what do you want your guests to feel? Not just what do you want them to do or like, what are your event goals? Like, maybe it's raising this many dollars, maybe it's this, but what do you want them to feel when they enter? And what do you want them to take away by the end? How do you want them to leave feeling? And if you want them to feel excited and joyful and happy, like you're going to think about that atmosphere. But if you just want them to feel safe and welcome and like they belong, you can do both of those. But they might be not every event is a rave. Not everything has to be high energy. And so it can be like, okay, if I want the people I'm inviting in this space to know that they're safe and that they belong and that they're welcome here, I'm going to think about, maybe I have a code of conduct posted somewhere and it's on the website for our event and they've seen it in advance. I'm going to have clear markers for who's working so that people know who they can ask for help. And I'm going to make that feel really welcoming. I worked with a festival. I worked with Bonnaroo and they actually changed their security staff. Some of their security staff got changed to safety staff and their vests said, how can we help? We're here for you. How can we help? That's a major shift. And that was like Bonnaroo got bought out and I don't know what they look like anymore, but that was on like an independent cool festival. But those adjustments made it go from like, oh, it feels like when it's security that it has to be some big problem to ask that person for help. But when it just says, hey, we're here for you, how can we help?
Yep.
And it's like a bright pink high-vis vest, that's going to make me feel like I can go ask that person, where do I throw out my bottle? And also, hey, this scary thing just happened. Where do I go? And so it's thinking, yeah, what do you want people to feel? And if it's really welcomed, then maybe you have more greeting staff than you're used to who are making sure people get that warm welcome when they walk in. We work with a Pride festival up in Sandpoint, Idaho, and they have folks who are handing out Pride stickers as folks enter. And that's a way to be like, hey, you're here and you get to be proud about it. And if someone declines it, that doesn't mean they get kicked out. But maybe that's a person we watch a little bit extra to be like, you came to a Pride event and you don't want a Pride sticker. That doesn't make you a bad person, but that makes me curious about sort of what's here. And that also can give some information to sort of everyone. So it is thinking about sort of who are the folks who've been marginalized and how are you centering them and supporting them? Because if we're supporting, and centering, making sure someone who's disabled can enter our space, then someone who's, doesn't have neurodivergence and is, doesn't need assistive devices is also going to feel welcome. And maybe even more so because we gave some clear information and support for folks who our society and our spaces often aren't actually designed for. So we have to back to your question, neutral, we have to counter what is neutral to make it a stronger, more welcoming space.
Well, and I think what's interesting too is unpacking in the nonprofit sector, specifically fundraising events have been spaces where we have put our values on hold sometimes for this one night a year where we're like not going to do that thing or talk about that thing that is actually
celebrate money.
That it, where some of our core values get put back in the last row versus sitting front and center. And so I think sometimes that's where that idea of neutrality comes from of like, well, we're not going to say this, but we're also not going to say that. And it's like, yes, by not saying either, you're actually saying a lot.
Yeah.
A lot. Yep.
I actually think even in the programming too, there's an opportunity there that when you actually live your values and you think about what do we want people feeling, what do we want people experiencing, what do we want them walking away with, that there's sometimes teaching moments that this may not be something that the Gen Pop has adopted, right? Like this may not be neutral, but we're going to have a teaching moment by leading by example. Yeah. We had an organization that was a primarily Black serving organization, and the audience that attended was a very sort of mixed community advocacy audience. And they were having a deep discussion about whether or not they began their event with Lift Every Voice and Sing. But that was authentic to them, and it was an opportunity for them to invite everyone along, right? But I think that shows up too in things like, do we have all gender restrooms that can be inclusive of anyone in attendance of our event?
Right.
Do we have a space for people to step away that might be inclusive of folks who are neurodivergent that need the calming pause moment? But I know that we're not always thinking about, from an inclusive perspective, we're not always thinking about who are all of those folks. And so I'm curious, who do you think we're leaving out when we're planning events, especially things like big gatherings? So many of our organizations have big Pride festivals, have big walk-run events, have big community organizing events that are street fairs and things like that. Who do you think we're leaving out when we're looking at emergency exits and, safety protocol around risk mitigation?
Yeah, I think so. A bunch of groups, right? I think one of the groups that often gets left out are disabled folks, because event spaces will think about the ADA as their template instead of about sort of belonging and inclusion as a higher standard. So that's one piece. I think folks who've experienced trauma, so everyone probably, but I think either people who are especially attuned to that, and maybe have done some healing and or boundary, might be like, oh, that place is not for me, versus someone else who might go and be like, oh my gosh, now I'm completely flooded and overwhelmed for having entered this space. So we might include people and then do them a disservice as it maybe a group within that. Sometimes we're, depending on who we're trying to serve. I mean, we should leave some groups out, right? Like, I think I would like for people who don't like the mission that we're serving to feel like they don't belong there, right?
Yeah.
And that sometimes neutral also doesn't signal to certain groups that this space isn't for them. Sometimes if you're doing a youth event and it doesn't feel clear that it's a youth event, you get a bunch of non-youth folks and it becomes not a youth event anymore. So I think there's different groups. I do think a lot of social justice groups right now aren't including youth voice enough, both like in the planning or in the room. And so thinking about what do we need to shift in order to get more young people wanting to show up. So many young people came of age during like the pandemic and online learning and the internet and all of these things that in-person gathering, they were brought up differently on that. And so we might need to do extra to really show the value of what an in-person gathering can be to young people who learned that gathering is dangerous. Right? Like if that was so much of your formative years was feeling like crowds are where bad things happen and alone in your bedroom with your phone is where you're safe, we have to do a lot to counteract that message and that lived embodied feeling of danger in a crowd. So I started rambling away from your original question, but the answer is like, it kind of depends on who you're serving, who you're accidentally leaving out. I've seen that a social justice organization, for example, who is like, we are a queer serving organization, they might be thoughtful about like queer folks who are native English speakers and able-bodied and have no,
right.
But it's like, okay, what about your like queer immigrants or your trans disabled folks, or right, like that intersection can start to not be showing up in our thinking, in our planning.
Can we? I want to go back to the trauma informed piece for a minute, because I think sometimes experientially, we all nod our heads when we use that phrase, right? I mean, who doesn't want to be trauma informed and leading from that place? But can you talk a little bit about experientially for a guest, what's happening for them in spaces that aren't trauma informed and what their nervous system is going through when they don't feel safe in a space? Because I think that helps folks underscore the need to pay attention.
Yeah.
So, and this goes back to the neutral, right? So if you're neutral, you're probably not trauma informed.
Correct.
Society, not trauma informed. And so, and I can use myself as an example, right? Like I'm a sexual assault survivor. I've talked about that a bunch publicly. So when I go into a space and I'm like, oh, there's no signs here. What if something bad happens and I need just to like quickly get my way out, and I don't want to talk to a stranger when I'm overwhelmed and scared and like end up crying to a stranger? How am I going to know where to go? Like I can start feeling my heart race, maybe getting like little sweaty palms and just starting to feel like, oh no, now I'm just going to be on alert forever, like this entire time. I might, if I'm seeing like, so communication is a part of trauma informed. Giving information is, because then it gives people agency. I think a lot about being trauma informed is giving people information so that they can make decisions about what's best for them. So when I can't read a room when I walk in, I'm like, it's not clear to me what's going on, who this is for, why am I here? Like, why did I get invited into this? Then that starts making me feel a little uneasy, to say like, okay, well, who else is going to be here? And then I'm like, clocking everyone else who's walking in the room, which isn't great for them or for me. And I think about, sort of some of the other pieces of just like that whole person, how do we meet people's needs? I think sometimes we especially right, like in fundraising and events and all these things where there's money involved, we start thinking about how can we upcharge things, and that's totally legit. I'm not hating on that, but there's also parts where it's like, can you make sure people can drink water? The number of events I've worked with teenagers just fainting left and right because they had to pay for water and they didn't have the money to do it is like kind of wild. And it's not just teenagers, but those were the ones that I, experienced. And as people get more, like each little thing like that can add more fear or overload onto our system. So if it's like, okay, I don't see the exits, but I do see a water station and I do see an all gender bathroom and I do see who's working here, those can sort of counteract some of it. So this is also not about achieving perfection. There is no perfection here.
Yeah.
But what is in our control? What can we do for that information? And the other piece there, again, around trauma informed, is that welcoming people, making sure people feel like they've been accepted and like brought into the space. For some folks, this can be a trauma piece. For some people, it can just be that they're anxious or they're awkward or they had a bad day, whatever it is.
Totally.
And having someone like go over and be like, hey, thank you so much for being here. What's your name? How can I help you find where you're going? This is what we're going to be doing. That also sort of like helps with that soothing to be like, okay, there are people here who are going to make sure that my experience is not just like left to the wild of whatever happens, because I think that piece of just feeling like, who sets the tone here? Is it the guests or is it the event holder, right? Like, is it the event producer? Because I don't know these guests, but presumably I know the event producer or the host who invited me in. If I feel like they're caring for me and they're going to pay attention to it, if someone crosses a line, if something happens, do I feel like I have trust in the people who gathered me here to get us out of it safely is the other part. Those are things that can, set someone's nervous system off. I keep going like this because like your vagus nerve, you feel a lot of it here, right? It can be your, can start, some people just start dissociating altogether. And they're like, okay, the only way I can be here is by not really being here. And I'm just going to float through this event, not in my body. And then other people who are able to sort of stay in their body might just be feeling like heart racing, stomach maybe starts to turn, and you're no longer absorbing what the event is for. Like you're so distracted by the danger signals that your body is sending you that like you can't actually just settle in and enjoy the event because everything's going to be going through this screen of, am I safe or is this dangerous? Rather than like, is this fun? Do I want to support this cause? Do I like feel moved by the speaker? That's all not going to be the primary experience of a guest who's on alert.
Well, as I'm listening to your examples, I immediately have like flashbacks to, I remember that in my body. I remember that when I was at an event. I know that experience from, that concert, that fundraiser, that, venue that was poorly laid out. And so we're going to take a short break, but when we come back, I want to think about and dive more into like the logistics elements and actions we can take, because I think that what you're indicating in a lot of what you're talking about is when we mitigate, when we think about those elements in advance, we can create that impact where the nervous system is able to actually be present. And I've experienced that when one guest is having an elevated nervous system response and another guest is suddenly having that I respond with it, like I can feel, and all of a sudden group dynamics, you have that, like, this is no longer a safe space for anyone. Yep. So I want to visit when we come back, what are those actions we can take that actually have that impact, that bring the nervous system down, that we can think about planning from a planner perspective, building into our events. So we'll be right back.
Ready to take your fundraising to the next level? Need to get unstuck in your event planning? Now's your chance to connect directly with the experts behind the Fundraising Elevator. Book a one-on-one consulting session with Sam for strategic planning and fundraising strategy, with Kristen for your programming and storytelling, or Mary for your registration and data tools. They're here to provide you personalized answers to all your event questions. Don't wait. Raise more at your next fundraising event. Book your session today at swaimstrategies.com. You can also find the link in our show notes.
Welcome back. We are here with Kim Warnick, and we are talking about safety at events and all the things that perhaps we have not thought about but are impacting how people are experiencing our events. Mm-hmm. If a nonprofit event producer is sitting down right now to plan their next gala, which it's spring and people are, what are the first 3 things that you would suggest they add to their planning process that have nothing to do with security guards? Because when we say safety, they go, we don't need security guards, end of conversation. So beyond that realm, which that's its own conversation, what are top 3 things for impact that you think they should start looking at?
Sure. So I would think first about site selection. So maybe you will always go to the same venue. Is that correct? Like, should you?
That's a
Maybe
really
you need to
good
take
question.
a step back. Like, should you still be going to the same venue? Have conditions changed since you first started this event, and maybe you need to think about that. I also want to acknowledge there are some small towns where like your site selection are limited, and that's we got to work with what we've got. But site selection, and when I say that, I mean it's like you need to understand who are you serving, who do you want in that room, and what are their needs, and what do you want them to feel, and can your venue meet those things? And that can be, accessibility needs, but it can also be fun needs. I mean, sometimes we do events in the, hotel banquet room, and maybe that's the right choice. It's a boring choice. And so it's like, what would it look like if one of the things we're trying to do is like instill local community and art and something? What does it look like to go to an art gallery instead, or to a different space that when you change the environment, you also change the vibe. So it's both like, what can that event space do, like very technically, for AV, for capacity, for, like the built safety, but also how does it make people feel when they walk in? And do they feel part of something? Do they feel confused about something? So site selection, staffing and training. I'm sneaking those into a single one to cheat your question of 3 things. Like, how many people do you need, and what skills do they need to have in order to make your event a success? I think you should definitely have some folks trained in de-escalation. It doesn't necessarily need to be everyone, but to your point of not, security guards, safety guards, you don't need that, but you do need people who can take a hot moment and help get it cooled down. Like, how do you train people who are maybe greeters, serving your alcohol, who are like in charge? Are those people all holding a set of skills so that they can handle something from a drunk guest who's, doing the most to a like protester who shows up about your event and is all heated up, right? Like, can you deal with a bunch of different sort of escalated situations and reclaim the safety in your space? So that's like how many people, who are they, what skills do they have, and really thinking about making sure that training is put in. And then I think a lot about the communication. So site selection, staffing and training, and then the communications. What are the different points where you can communicate to your people, and how are you making sure you're communicating to them? And safety stuff, like, I'd encourage you to try to make it not boring, right? Like, I think if I've just flown Southwest anytime recently, sometimes they'll like have someone do a knock joke, like their flight attendant, to get your attention, and then they'll be like, great, now that I have your attention, here's our safety briefing, and they put little jokes in there and whatever. It's a script. You don't have to be like wildly creative or a comedian who can go off the cuff, but thinking about how do you cut through the noise to the people and get them the information they need, and what is that information? So, and what are your tools? It's your website, it's the event page, it's social media, it's signage in the space, it's the people who are talking to people, right? Like your greeters, but it's also the follow-up afterwards. Like, are you ready that, say an incident happens, are you ready to just send out comms? We did a conference recently, nonprofit conference, where we had an event binder that had, here are like 70 it wasn't 70. Here are 17, maybe different scenarios. Who's the lead? What sort of like what needs to be involved? And what are the messages that we can create immediately? So we had quick template messages for these different scenarios so that if something happened, we could push a like comms out in the moment, and then we'd have a template to edit after the fact, because comms doesn't rise to the top when you're in the middle of it, but it's actually the thing that allows your guests to know that you got it, as if you're ready to communicate.
Yeah.
I want to touch on each of those things.
Yes.
Because I think there's so many valuable like build outs of those. So site selection, I was so glad that you indicated that, because I was like, it is an important question that frequently in our work starts with, well, how many can the event site hold, right? The capacity is usually the number one question. But I have frequently been in the space where something else is also happening, like a convention center, a hotel ballroom, where there are other things happening in the space. And I think one of those questions we have to ask—
That perhaps are not in alignment, Sam? Is that what you're saying?
And I think one of the questions we have to ask when we're in a venue where we are not exclusive, in that it's not just our event, but there might be other events happening, is understanding what those events are. I think it is unfortunate, but most of those big venues are just signing the contract for the dollar amount. They're not thinking about whether or not these two audiences work well together. And who's coming, and is this going to feel inclusive? And the interesting thing is I frequently have seen that it turns into a negative experience for both events if it is a conflict of any kind, right? So I think understanding what else is happening in the venue is a consideration. You also said that placemaking really sets a vibe. And I want to emphasize that, because we just had an event where things changed for their audience. Their audience was all of a sudden shifting toward an older demographic, and mobility was a big priority. But the venue that they had been in prior did not offer a lot of mobility options. It was an old building that just hadn't been upgraded. And the conversation then became, oh, what are we telling folks when we have to send them through like the service elevator in the back door versus a event site that actually is
Where you're welcome,
inclusive and welcoming to that demographic that we have coming. The second thing that you touched on was staffing and training. One of the things that we've done with our team is that we've gone through sort of sexual assault safety training for our team. We've also gone through protest training for our team. And then we've also gone through gun safety violence with our team. And if nothing else, I do feel like as an organization who gathers people, if you're a nonprofit holding a pride parade, if you're holding a volunteer day, it's important as a group that you're at least having conversations about who would be the response person. How would we respond to this? And one of the number one things that comes up for us that I see frequently, and I wanted to kind of pick your brain about, was protests. That we frequently see fear of protests. It doesn't always happen, but there often is fear of protest, and for lots of reasons. We have seen that, well, this is a topic that maybe, or this is a mission that maybe other community members don't support, right? Because in the news and in the media, we're hearing messages. There's a fear of protesters showing up. There also sometimes becomes issues where like some staff person was let go and there's a fear of retaliation. We've also seen issues of staff unionizing, and there's a fear of, will a unionizing effort show up in an event space that's intended for a public audience? We have a very specific protocol that we follow, but I'm curious because when you and I talked beforehand, you talked about understanding the difference between a threat and an agitator. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that, because I think that that's a consideration that frequently any concern throws a red flag. And I'm of the mindset that if you plan for it, it won't happen. Like if you make a plan, put the plan in place, you'll be good to go. But I also feel like you have a really healthy dose of assessment that is valuable.
Yeah, thanks. And so I just want to name that we're talking about like protesters coming to event. We're not talking about protests as an event. So you're hosting an event and thinking about like a risk assessment lens. So maybe you're hearing rumblings. I'll take one of those as an example about like maybe there'll be some union activity and maybe some protesting at your site. And so the first question is like, is that a problem? Like, what's the threat? What's the concern? Like, what is it that you're worried about? And get specific. And I'm not saying that to be dismissive. Like, maybe the worry is we put so much thought into this program and that we're worried that like speakers are going to get cut off. And we're worried about like maybe specific speakers who are the most marginalized or whose voices aren't otherwise being heard. Maybe a protest is going to upstage these speakers and that's going to hurt our programming. That's a very different concern than it won't look good in front of my donors, which is also a concern, but is not like a physical danger threat. But you can worry about it as, a financial threat. Like, okay, if it looks like we're out of control, what does that mean? And so you have to just get sort of specific about like sort of what are you afraid of, and get narrower than like optics or safety, right? Because safety is just a giant umbrella. So if it's like, oh, well, we're worried that because this group has a history of using, targeting individuals, harassing them online, and then maybe like showing up and trying to dox them. That's really different than this group brings drums and it's loud and annoying.
Right.
Both are concerns and you can think about them both, but you have to get sort of specific in what it is that you're worried about with an event or with a specific threat. And sometimes I actually think when you're a team, it's helpful to start with things that feel more neutral. So like fire, because it's not really people. I mean, you're worried about the people in the fire, but it's not like there's no intention behind it unless you have a pyromaniac, I guess. But that's not what we're going to talk about. Right. But it's just like, okay, what are we worried about and can we address it? Right. And if you start with the things that they don't feel, they're depersonalized, right? It's like, if this shows up, what are we going to do? It helps get people like warmed up on assessing like what's the actual potential impact to our event, our guests, our mission, and how can we mitigate it? We're going to have smoke detectors. We're going to have a plan for what to do. We're going to have fire exits. We're going to pick a building that doesn't have a history of a lot of fire, right? Like maybe there's a building that's known for fires. You probably shouldn't pick them, right? But whatever it is, of just sort of like you make those decisions. So going back to something like a protest, if you're a little bit warmed up to that practice of like getting specific, you can then say, okay, well, we're worried about, in our state, this bill, this very like anti-LGBTQ bill was just passed. We're worried about anti-LGBTQ protesters showing up, harassing, trying to get photos of attendees to dox them, and being intentionally intimidating. Maybe they're going to show up with guns. Maybe they're going to show up in tactical gear, or like that. You're getting specific about what you're worried about. You're worried about both the actual safety and the comfort of the guests that you're inviting in. You're worried about sort of like the ability for your event to move forward. So if that's a thing that you're imagining, then you have to sort of, the risk assessment is there any history? Like, is that just a fear you've dreamed up, or are there rumblings of it online? Are there groups that have done this in the past to similar events? Are there groups who have done this maybe in a couple towns over that you're worried about? So also trying to get a little bit more specific about the likelihood of an event and how much energy are you going to put towards something? Because, I'm sure our brains collectively can dream up the worst case scenarios of everything. Right. You also then need to get more specific to say like, okay, are we worried about that? Oh, like actually, yeah, here's a couple tweets that like are indicating it. And actually they have historically been able to go from online threats or taunts to in-person mobilization. And if that's what you're starting to see, you reach out to a group like Western State Center or another group who has that expertise, because then that starts to feel like, oh, this is maybe a bigger threat than we're equipped to deal with as, for our fundraising event. But if you're just sitting in a room imagining it and you don't have any specific threats of it, maybe it's just trying to find, well, what would we want to be able to quickly do? So that also matters, because we do have limited resources and limited things. You cannot prepare for every single possible thing that can happen, but you can get some folks who are in place so that, if, for example, like protesters were to show up, and again, there weren't any specific signs that was happening, but maybe 3 folks showed up and they're trying to, sort of push for union demands, like hopefully you've got some folks who you've tasked as like, okay, well, those will be the people who deal with any sort of disruptors, right? Like this person has the de-escalation skill set. They have some decision-making authority so that they don't have to like run something up the chain of command. And they have like a container to work within. So I often, for these things, will say no signs are allowed. We don't do signs at our events. They're distracting. They hold things up. So if you want to come in and you have a t-shirt, like you have your t-shirt, but you can't bring in signs. That makes a disruption less disruptive if you can't hold up a sign. You might have a similar rule about like, we don't allow instruments. Like we love that you want to bring joy, but we're bringing our own joy. We like curated this really clearly. So like if you bring any sort of like noise making things, we're actually going to ask you to like check them at the door, and here's the place that you can do that, right? So if there's things like, there are some rules that you can put in place that don't take away someone's like freedom of expression. If someone shows up at your event and it's value aligned, to say like, hey, people want to push for workers' rights and they want to do it in our space, and like for some reason we don't feel like we're already like nailing it, that we might be a target. Like do some reflection on that in and of itself, but also like you don't have to say like no one's allowed here in order to take away the major disruption of that, which might be like the noise and the signs. And, if people are going around to tables, you can say like, actually, like this is a ticketed event. You need to have a ticket to come in. So there's a lot of different like tips and tricks I started to sort of tick off there that can mitigate some of these, that if you're worried about protesters and it's a ticketed event, then like, do they have a ticket? If you're a fundraiser and your tickets are raising you money and protesters bought tickets and came in, like, say thanks. Thanks for supporting us. Right. And we don't allow signs. So, and if they don't have a ticket, then they can't come in. Or if it's open to the public, maybe you have to think about that. Like, do people need to have an RSVP in order to come, to sort of make sure that who's in the room and that they're vetted and that they're the people that you want to be in the room.
One of the questions that we've asked our clients frequently when this comes up is which you touched on, which is, what is the fear? Like, what are you concerned about? What are the concerns? And oftentimes what we find, especially around protest action, is that they're worried about the response, right? Like they're less worried about the protest. They intuitively feel like, stand up for your rights, fight for what you want, speak up, First Amendment. But they also have a fear of it being handled poorly. And so then it becomes simply a matter of, okay, well, how do we handle it then? And once we have that protocol in place, which we have a very specific protocol where, going back to the earlier conversation about being trauma-informed, we try to make sure it's very clear to an audience that this is not part of the program, so that individuals can make their own choice to understand, but we don't try to stop it. We do things like flip the lights on and turn the screens off so it's clear, like, this is not programming. But we're not going to stop it. We stand back from the mic. We let the protest action start, happen. And then when it's over, we thank everyone for their patience. And then we go back to lights down program and we move forward, so that we're thinking about both the experience of how it's being handled and managed, but also the experience for the guest to be able to make an informed choice for themselves. Because if they don't feel safe, if their vasovagal response is on high alert and they need to get up and leave, they should have that option as well. You mentioned de-escalation, though, and I also want to share a story of, we were working on an event with ACLU, And they had a speaker that was an activist that had been very prominent in the Black Panther community. And she had fears of what are your safety measures? What actions are you taking? And also, you better not have armed guards anywhere. I don't want to see any uniforms. And our brainstorming team and solution was that we engaged a team of drag queens to be our front line because they could both be welcoming, but they also could be de-escalation tactics, right? So if someone showed up clearly looking intimidating or looking like they were there uninvited or looking like they were there to instigate, they could de-escalate the situation. But if it was a guest that was ticketed and coming to the event, they could welcome them, right? So we had this sort of like dual role that they were playing, and they were amazing, and it was awesome. And it allowed for us to have a plan, but also to be welcoming in the same space versus uniformed officers at a door, right? So a little experience that we pulled forward that we always loved sharing because it was a like really simple solution that their team came up with, and it yielded such a great experience for everyone.
No, I love that example. And it also reminds people that, like, be creative, right? You know your community's best. So we try to give guidance and sort of a framework for people to operate within. But how you do it, whether, it's like, okay, we need some greeters and de-escalators. Who is going to be that? Like in that community, it might be drag queens. In another community, it might be, hip hop, like the hip hop community. Like, you just know your audience, know what vibe you're trying to set, and choose who are those right greeters, and do they have, again, the skills and the authority. Like, have you granted them the authority to be able to say, no, you cannot come in? Yes, you can. Like, making sure that whoever you're putting into those positions has your backing and your confidence, but also like can actually do something if something goes on. I've been put in positions before where they're like, you're the de-escalator, but you can't kick anyone out. And I was like, well, what if they don't de-escalate?
You've taken away one of my tools.
Right. And so then I have to go find someone with that power, which is very hard to both de-escalate and run away to like find the boss. So you need to give people, I think that's the other piece I've seen. People are sometimes afraid to delegate that authority and to give that trust away. And that's so much of events is building trust with your event team so that you can give that response, like sort of decentralize your command center, because you need a team to make events safe. And those team members need to be empowered to make judgment calls in the moment.
Along those lines, what are some of the conversations that event planners within organizations aren't having with their leadership teams, their boards of directors around safety that they're avoiding, that you actually feel like should be front and center, that they should be having?
Yeah, I actually think site selection is a really big one. I think there are a lot of nonprofits that have a rinse repeat plan for their events, and that there are a lot of sites who maybe 2 years ago were more values aligned than they are right now. So that's a big one that I think people are avoiding, is where we're hosting our events actually values aligned? And are they still, and those questions of, if they're hosting multiple events, are the other events values aligned? So I think that is a really big one that people are not digging into enough, is this the right place, like physical space to host in? I think the question around, like, who do we want in the room, and who are we okay with not being in the room? Because you actually can't serve everyone. And when we talk about inclusivity, it's not about inclusivity for every single person, because then there's a point where your event is for no one if it's for everyone. And so who are you really trying to serve? And how can you just accept that your event isn't for everyone? And maybe if you're a group that serves like a multitude of audiences, you might just have to do multiple events to capture them all, right? Like, rather than shoving everyone into one room. So I think that piece of just being more honest with ourselves about who is this event for, and what are the decisions we're going to make that might actually cut some other people out, right? I think if, even, and just building some comfort around that and being able to say, okay, if we're cutting some people out, how are we giving them, and they're important to us, how are we giving them another space to show up, and making them not feel forgotten, but instead you can do inclusivity by having multiple streams of events. So I think site selection is a big one, being really honest about like narrowing our audience to be someone that a group of people we can realistically serve and make them feel like they belong. And that does not mean you can't be like a multicultural or multi-generational or multilingual space. You can, but there's so many people, so many different needs. We can't serve them all the time at every event on a single event budget versus, an event venue who might need to be able to do this all the time. I think those two are big. And then I think this last piece I was talking about is sort of like who has power and control in this space. And one of the ways that we can build safety is by having more people with some power so that there's not one or two people who hold all the power. That like, one, if they do something, well, are we supposed to too? But also like, I don't know, what if they're just in the bathroom and an emergency happens? Like, do you really like our plans can't rest on one or two people's shoulders. And so we need to start building trust in more of our staff and more of our teams to be able to step into those roles by giving them the training and the information they need to do it, but to really start to feel like, okay, there is more community or team ownership of our events so that they, and I think one of the reasons why this is hard is because as you give over more control, people have opinions and they might want to shape your event a little different. And if you want it to look one way and you're like, there's people saying, hey, actually, this might not work, that can start to get frustrating, but that actually helps if you bring people in earlier, right, in the planning and help bring those voices in and help give a little bit more control and power over to like a broader number of people. You can also shape things earlier rather than saying like, okay, we're going to tell people one day before the event that they're the de-escalation human and also they weren't involved in any of the decisions. And so now they're dealt with the consequences of whatever crappy policies you created, like best of luck. That person's not going to be super happy with you as someone who's been in that position many a time. All right. To be like, I'm sorry, you invited who to what? And now like, I know there's going to be clashes here. And you now just want me to just put my body between a bunch of people who you knew we're going to have words with each other. Like maybe we shouldn't have maybe this was a bad event. And that you're now trying to claw back by like throwing some people who have like safety expert in their name or their titles to be like, you can figure it out, right? I'm like, actually, I can't. I'm not magical, right? Like, and so I think that piece of just sort of like, who are you involving in decision making? Who is going to have some like power and control in your space? And when are you involving them so that you can design something that's actually workable and effective?
Yeah, if you want to design a space for more people, you have to have more people
in the
help
conversation.
You design the space.
Yeah.
Yes.
You said who has control in the space or who has the power in the space. And I immediately went to a very different dynamic, thinking about power dynamics of authority, less of who has decision-making power. And oftentimes in fundraising events, we're talking about money, right?
Yeah.
Like money wields power or an assumption of power.
Or some folks think it does.
Right. And we have had situations where you have both alcohol and money in the same space, and suddenly you have a whole new cocktail that you're making, which is needing to address sexual behavior, sexual assault, inappropriate behavior. And we went through a de-escalation training and adopted a policy, and it was like a magic button. And like, it's unbelievable to me that a piece of paper can have this sort of impact. But all of a sudden, we now had a policy that I have utilized many times to say, I'm sorry, we have a zero tolerance policy and it's been reported to me, whatever it is, I don't even have to say the action. We have a zero tolerance policy and I need to ask you to leave, or I need to ask you to stop that behavior. And people know exactly what you're talking about. It's not about their actions or behavior. They don't have to defend their actions. They don't have to get angry even, because it's about the policy. And it is amazing how quickly people go, yep, got it, no problem. Shocking to me, because when we don't talk about it as leaders and planners, and then we find ourselves in a situation where something is occurring, knowing how to respond to that is really challenging. But with the staff training and then with the policy in place, there was a very clear action. And that policy was simply gave me the authority to walk up to the person and say, I have a volunteer that's reported feeling uncomfortable. We have a zero tolerance policy. I need to ask you to leave. And immediately they're like, okay, goodbye. So I have a curiosity, because I know your work started in sexual assault prevention. What other policies have you seen adopted that you think organizations should be applying, especially when they are gathering around a mission, oftentimes a mission that can be seen as, a side, so to speak, whether it be social justice issue? What are the policies that you've seen create safer space and adopted easily?
Yeah, I think an anti-harassment policy of some sort. I'm not a fan of zero tolerance ones because I think we do have some tolerance, but also that's just going to be your value. And you need to figure like that. Sometimes like it might be a comment that you can give feedback on, and it's like a one warning before you go, but it still needs to be very specific. So I also think if it's zero tolerance is as specific as it gets, I just know a lot of folks don't actually have the stomach to implement that. And so we often will offer sort of an anti-harassment policy where it's like this set of behaviors gets a warning and this set of behaviors, no warning, you're just gone. And here are the ways that you're documenting it so you know a warning has been given and whatever it is. So I think, so an anti-harassment policy. I also think there are interesting structural things you can do. So one, it's fundraising and music industry have a lot in common around power structures, right? So there's VIPs in both spaces, right? And when you tell someone they're a VIP,
permission,
they now expect to be very important in your space, and they expect to be sort of catered to and to be getting special perks, and to maybe when they say jump, you say how high. So it can be changing the language you use. Don't call people VIPs or if you're going to call people VIPs, who are you calling that? Is it the people you're honoring for their work in the community, or is it the person who gave the biggest check? And then you gotta stand in that way. If you choose that the VIP is the person who wrote the biggest check, then like that's something that you need to make sure that your staff has some protections in place, right? To say like, hey, if that person then does these things, we're going to strip that. They're not that important, right? They might be very important, but they're not more important than your dignity. So I think some of it is, that policy, but it can be about the titles we use. It can be about not having VIPs or changing who are the VIPs. It can be thinking structurally about sort of like what are the ways people can, like who gets talked to by whom, right? Like, do your biggest donors get to talk to the ED and your grassroots donors get to talk to the entry level staff? And then what does that mean when then that like crosses lines? And so it's also thinking structurally about sort of like who's owning relationships and how are we thinking about the power dynamics within that, and helping people who are going to, if it's like, hey, we actually want our program staff to be networking with our major donors, how are you making sure that they understand that like their dignity matters a lot to you, and that if any of these things, not just harassment for sure, but also just someone like using icky language about your work, like do they have the permission to push back, or are they supposed to just be like, donor's gonna donor? Like you have to make those decisions and then communicate them to your staff, especially your staff who are not typical fundraising staff, who maybe don't have the same skill set about sort of engaging in that sort of dialogue, as to say, here's what we are hoping for, and then here's sort of like, if you need help, here's who to go to, but also here's where we're going to have your back. Like, you don't have to nail it, but if something's getting pushed up against values, here's some options for you.
Yeah. The piece that cuts across so many areas of bad behavior, alcohol, is, it's something that's present at events. We're trying to broaden what that looks like for folks so that it's less focal. But do you have specific advice about alcohol service for folks and what they need to be thinking about around that and implications that come out of alcohol service that they should be thinking of when they're thinking about safety?
Yeah. I recommend not open bars. Doesn't mean you can't buy people drinks, but you can set a limit on the number of drinks, because open bars mean however much someone decides to drink that day. And that's, a choice you're not in control of. And so I did just advise against open bars, and instead, like drink tickets. Again, you can still be generous. You can tell your event servers to not do heavy pouring. I'm not saying like not give people a reasonable drink, but some, like, a mixed drink should not have 3 shots in it. So when we're dealing with liquor, like, make sure that a drink is 1 serving of alcohol, and as wine and beer, like, percentages, whatever, the strength of our drinks is getting stronger and stronger. So like, tell them to use a smaller glass for a higher alcohol beverage, so that like 1 serving means 1 serving of alcohol. You might be seen as a downer for that, but like, that's just something you can do. And again, if it also gives like the servers a little bit more space to be able to like not overserve someone if they're able to better track sort of how many drinks, because if someone starts buying their own drinks, not using drink tickets, that gives that server a better understanding of how many drinks someone's had. So those are the ones I like, just from what's in your control, instructing your event servers to 1 serving means 1 serving. Use drink tickets so that you can contain that. Always make sure there's food. I think this is like one of the ones people underthink about, is like, is there food besides, okay, maybe you're doing a plated dinner for like a gala, but are there enough snacks? Because the drinking happens before the dinner does.
Right.
And I don't know, I've been at events where like my table is served last and I haven't eaten, and like, I wasn't trying to be drunk, but I didn't know that this was going to be the like program of events. So are there like some hearty snacks so that if people are drinking, they're not like accidentally becoming tipsy? And then just having interesting non-alcoholic drinks. Like, there's so many more on the market now, but like, if you're going to have a signature cocktail, you should have a signature mocktail. And that's both for sober folks, but also just, I don't know, there are a lot of people who drink because it's more interesting than water or soda. And if you're giving options to folks that want to just like have a more interesting beverage but are not trying to drink, then you'll just see that decrease on its own anyway. So yeah, drink tickets, no open bars, real 1 serving, and have interesting NA options so that people feel like they can participate in the fun and have like a celebratory feeling drink without it making that, you want people to feel like they're participating in that part of the event, because the food and beverage are a huge part of the culture of your event.
Right.
And if the only NA option is like, you can have a Pepsi, like, that's a bummer. That's not I don't feel like I'm at a gala if I'm having a soda. So like, what is the thing that makes people feel like they're still participating and still getting a sense of the experience?
We have a couple of things I'll add to that mix too. So we always make sure water is with no lines. Like, you don't have to go stand at the bar to get water, right? Like, water stations, water fountains, making sure that there's always accessible water that does not require you to go to the bar. When we pass alcohol, we also always make sure that there is the fun NA option on the tray. So you can be offered the glass of red wine or the fun, bubbly, cocktail looking NA option. And then we also, on the tables, it's a common practice to put a bottle of wine on the tables. we often will also put water on the table, like a water refill pitcher, and coffee on the table, or have the server pouring. And then I've seen a recent trend in bars that I actually think we should adopt more at events, which is giving the servers a card that simply says, "You've overconsumed. You can walk away with no embarrassment, or we're going to cut you off." And it's an interesting option, I think, because in that public social setting, when you're like doing it up and you're like way, having a big celebration, but all of a sudden have like crossed that line, that can often become confrontational. And to keep it non-confrontational and say, you're done, by just literally passing them a card and then passing them a seltzer water and they can grab their glass and walk away, I think is a really like elegant solution in mitigating that.
Yeah, I love that. Because it's also about the dignity of that person,
Yeah.
A lot of people aren't trying. I mean, some people are, but most people
Right.
who are get a little wild at an event didn't go into the night being like, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this charity event and get wasted and make a fool of myself. Like, that's my goal for tonight, right? Like, but for people who aren't off, you just sort of like enter into this space where you're like, it's fun time, and don't use your whole brain. And you just have to, I think event planners need to remember that their guests are using very small portion of their brain when they come into your space. And that like you're trying to set the environment up so that it's harder for them to make bad choices, right? Like, you're talking about wine on the table. You also could just not have wine on the table. I know that's like a common practice, but it's not like people must have alcohol within reach at all times or they're going to leave your event. They can walk to the bar and get a glass of wine if they really want it. So there's a lot of things that you can do that just create a little barrier between someone's potential poor decision making and where they are, that they have to want. People should have to want to get drunk at your event, right? And like, so much of how we set up events is so that people can just like, there's alcohol coming at them from every direction. It's being passed. It's on the table. It's at the bar. It's like in the people are doing. It's everywhere, right? And it's like that. Actually, you're asking the individuals to make all the decisions instead of you making a bunch of decisions in advance.
Yeah.
Well, and I think with all those, you can, and I think that's what we're talking about in general here. Yeah. There are so many ways you can make decisions that take some of the options off the table.
Yeah, de-escalate the situation.
Right.
Yeah.
We're not talking about there only being one way.
Right.
But we are talking about how do you set people up for success.
Yeah. We worked with another event planner that one of his sort of gifts, I thought, in event spaces was that he was able to sort of see a potential risk and just call it out and say no. Right. So like someone who was going for another drink that he already thought had overconsumed, he would just approach that person and be like, mm-mm. And they would walk away, like, because the intention isn't for them to overconsume or embarrass themselves. But when someone points it out, we had an elevator door open and two people were very clearly into each other. And he just said no. And they like straightened up, apologized, and walked out. That just that ability to simply de-escalate that moment by having clear policy in place, empower the person to make decisions, and then
just say no.
Be able to pull the volume down. Well, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to ask Kim to step into the fundraising elevator. We'll be right back.
Change. It doesn't happen on its own. It happens on purpose. Thanks to nonprofits that believe a brighter future is not just possible, but needed and deserved, and that connect people to causes and turn moments of generosity into movements. That's why Bloomerang is built for purpose, to raise the bar on what's possible and help every act of giving lead to more. Because when the bottom line is a better world, no goal is too lofty. Bloomerang, built for purpose.
Welcome back. We are here talking about safety and so many of the things we've experienced at events.
The poor decisions people make.
And the decisions that they could make better. Kim, we ask all of our guests to join us in the fundraising elevator. What is a tip or a parting thought you would leave with our nonprofit superheroes out there so that they can continue to head up?
I would say sort of spend more time with this question on vibes and on what do you want people to feel and experience, and just spend a little bit more time on that question with your teams before any major event, but also, before your communications that go out. Like, how do you want people to feel? And what are the little tweaks that you can make to your wording, to your environment, to how a message is delivered to land on a feeling? I think a lot of us in the nonprofit world spend a lot of time thinking about what people might think. And I just encourage everyone to think more about how we might feel. How is this going to leave someone? And is it leaving them better or worse?
That's great.
I love that. We are big fans of Western State Center. So I want to encourage everyone to follow the work of Western State Center. We believe strongly that democracy is rooted in gathering, and that bringing people together is how we solve problems and build missions and create impact. And so we want people to keep gathering safely. We have a number of free resources in our show notes that we're going to include, including a venue guide from Kim and a guide on safeguarding arts and cultural spaces, both totally amazing resources. Plus, we have a webinar coming up that Kim and her colleague Chris are going to do in June about ice safety, which I feel like is a big hot topic that folks are looking to figure out solutions for. So we hope you'll join us there. And Kim, if people want to know more about your work or where to get a hold of you, how can they find you?
Yep. So for the work that I lead is the Culture Lab program of Western State Center. So we've got a newsletter that's specific to the Culture Lab work that there should be a link to that you can sign up for. And if you have any specific questions or, are looking for help or guidance, culturelab@wscpdx.org is an email that goes both to me and to my colleague. That's why I give the generic one, because it's just the two of us, but then, we'll make sure we see it. So culturelab@wscpdx.org is a good way to find us. And then, we're on the socials. We're on Instagram, Blue Sky, and Facebook and LinkedIn. I think we are not of TikTok and X these days for reasons. So Western State Center, you can find us there and learn about our work.
Amazing. Awesome. Well, we are so appreciative that you do this work. So appreciative of the Western State Center for investing in this work. And we look forward to having you join us in June to teach us all about ice safety. And thank you for being on the podcast today. We appreciate you.
And thanks so much for having me and for the space that you've created.
Thanks.
The Fundraising Elevator is produced by Swaim Strategies at the studios of the AV department. The program is produced and directed by Steve Osborne, with audio engineering and original music by Dwayne Anderson and Heidi Christensen. Video production by John Collier. Graphic design by Pendulum Creative Group. And voiceover by Josh Boykin.
Friends, before we leave you, we want to ask for your help to make the podcast grow. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please follow, subscribe to the Fundraising Elevator. And if you're getting a lot out of the show, please share it with a friend and leave a review. These things help make sure that the podcast continues heading up. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Are you ready to engage supporters and grow your base with your own podcast? Then let us introduce you to our partners at the AV department in Portland, Oregon. In addition to delivering exceptional live event audiovisual production and videography, they also have a top-tier production studio and an expert team ready to take your content ideas to the next level. Contact the AV department to schedule a consultation and start bringing your podcast vision to life.